if you send me a link on, I'll put it out on Twitter.
Yeah, I believe we are now live. I'll just get that link for you. Give it a little bit of time for some people to log in. People, not bad. Okay, people rolling in now. So we find that link. Welcome, guys. Just waiting for a few people to join. I'm getting some echo there, Darren.
Do you have a link that I can share on Twitter?
Yep, just check your DMs right now.
Okay. Great.
Okay, we are live, 67 people. So I wanted to start off by talking about the Republican establishment and what they've done, or rather failed to do, on the question of big tech. We know they had the House and the Senate for 2 years, from 2016 to 2018, where they could have done something about the issue, but they did nothing. And now we're about 3 weeks from the election, and Twitter's just brazenly censoring President Trump. But I think we saw something recently that kind of exposes the cowardice that a lot of elected, not all elected Republicans, there are some good ones, but many elected Republicans, especially Republican leadership on the Hill, have, which, we had a Republican Senate candidate, Lauren Witzke, get locked out of her Twitter account for criticizing mass migration, for essentially making the same points that Donald Trump did in 2016. And there was an astonishing silence from the leading Republican senators who talk about big tech censorship. It's almost like some of these people care more about the censorship of dissidents in Hong Kong, which is an interesting issue. It doesn't really affect America that much, but it seems like they spend more time talking about that than they do about their own Senate candidates getting censored. It's almost like it's easier to defend to talk about censorship abroad than censorship of America First candidates here at home. Apparently that's a lot harder for them to do. What do you think about that, Darren?
Well, I think that's right. I don't know a tremendous amount about the details of this specific Senate candidate. I do know that she criticized immigration and was censored by Twitter, and it doesn't seem like there's much outcry at all. But I think maybe the larger point is not that there is an outcry, which there should be, of course, but even in cases where there is outcry, that's all that there is. And I mean, so you don't have to go to the Senate candidate. You have the President of the United States himself being censored by Twitter, and all he can do, ironically, is angrily tweet about it. And it is kind of it's not entirely the president's fault, or maybe not even all his fault, but it is a kind of a pathetic situation in which you have the President of the United States being censored by Twitter, and all he can do is angrily tweet about it. Now, I think your point about China is interesting. For those who follow my Twitter, they would know that I've kind of generated this, facetious meme, but it's meant to illustrate an important point. This is not to carry water for China, which is it's a dystopia that censors its own people. It's merely to caution against the United States becoming more like China, and by pointing fingers at China in order to deflect from the fact that we are becoming like China. And so you have, it's all the fashion, it's all the rage now on the Republican side to point at, the only thing, more popular is pointing out, look at what the left did. Look at what the left did. Oh, look what they did to us today. Well, the only genre almost as popular as that is like, oh, look what the Chinese Communist Party did to the Uyghurs. Meanwhile, you have American citizens being censored. You have American cities being burned. we have enough problems here, and yet we find this bizarre and truly pathetic situation where the Republican leaders can muster up all the courage imaginable to stand up for free speech for Uyghurs and for protesters in Hong Kong, but they're able to do nothing to protect American citizens whose speech is being censored by these big tech companies. And this strange asymmetry is reflected actually in policy. For instance, the TikTok issue. And again, it's like all of these, people get angry, but I have to say, it's these fake victories of telling, oh yeah, well, we really showed TikTok. See, isn't that great? Well, look, this is not to shill for TikTok. This is not to carry water for TikTok. Maybe in a perfect world, we would put TikTok in its place, but that would be the fifth, maybe sixth, maybe 10th thing on our priority list. The fact is that TikTok, compared to the big tech firms, is not as censorious against Trump supporters.
Well, I would disagree with that. I think they are somewhat censorious towards Trump supporters, but that's not because they're a Chinese company. Ironically, it's because they're American. The American arm of TikTok hired content moderators from Facebook and Twitter, so their content moderation works in much the same way. But it's not because of a Chinese influence. It's actually much the opposite. It's because of a Silicon Valley influence.
Right. I guess
if you had Chinese censors that censor you for talking about Tiananmen Square or Hong Kong or the Uyghurs, they probably wouldn't care if you talked about Black Lives Matter or voter fraud or COVID-19 even. Well, maybe COVID-19, but certainly the other issues they wouldn't care so much about. I think the broader issue here is, let's stop China from happening in America before we worry about stopping China in China, right? We already have a social credit system.
The point, though, about TikTok, though, is that TikTok, I'm not super familiar with all the details of TikTok, but I think if you compare its censoriousness, say, to Twitter, to Google, certainly not more censorious than them, and probably in certain respects less. And in any case, it has nowhere near the effect on American political discourse as those other companies who are, in some cases, its competitors. And so for the first action on big tech to be this thing to slap the hand of TikTok, which is the competitor of these much bigger, much more important, much more malicious tech companies that are ripping the tongues out of the mouths of tens of millions of Trump supporters, speaks to either a lack of proper priorities or simply the fact that that was the low-hanging fruit, and there is no mechanism really to go after the actual big tech companies that have the power and who are having an effect on our public discourse by censoring our speech.
You have to wonder what the motivation of the Republican establishment is for being so slow on this issue. I mean, is it cowardice? Is it incompetence? Or is it actual malice? Do they want the Trump movement to get suspended secretly? Is that what they hope for? So they can go back to the old Bush-Obama paradigm where you have neoliberals and neoconservatives swapping power every 4 or 8 years. That's what I wonder. And again, I don't want to talk about all Republicans here. I mean, hashtag not all Republicans, right? There are some great people in Congress who've pushed forward on this issue. I'm thinking of Paul Gosar, Matt Gaetz. Ted Cruz is pretty good. Gaetz and Gosar.
As someone once said, some I assume are good people, and that also applies to congressional Republicans.
Yeah, and even there are a few senators. I mean, Hawley probably. I'm amazed again that no Republican senator came out and defended the candidate in Delaware, probably because she's too America first for them.
Hawley is very strong on the Uyghur issue.
He's very strong on the Uyghur issue. He's pretty good on tech. His Section 230 reform proposal is not the worst I've seen. It has some issues. He certainly helped make it a national issue for Republicans, so we can't knock him too much there. But again, these guys seem very cautious. I mean, when conservatives and right-wingers get banned from these platforms, oftentimes you won't see Republican lawmakers speaking out to defend them. Again, people like Gosar are the exception here.
Well, look, it's not just like there are two different dimensions to it. Well, there are multiple dimensions, but two operative dimensions that I'm thinking about at the moment. One is what is the person's stated position on an issue, but what's more important is really what priority it has. You can have someone who says the right stuff about tech because, well, it's popular and for good reason. But if it's not an actual priority and you're not actually willing to do what it takes, go into the weeds and figure out the way to actually implement policy that corrects the problem, then it's simply the same type of grandstanding that we see in virtually every other domain of our politics.
That brings up an interesting point, and after this, I'm going to shift gears and talk a little bit about algorithms and the role they play in censorship, because I think more people need to understand exactly how that works. But just one more policy question I have for you: what do you think is the policy solution here? How do we solve the tech giants? I have my own idea, which is we essentially need to create an industry-wide standard where users are able to either opt out or opt into any content filters that are created by the tech platforms. And if you want to be a platform, if you don't want to be a publisher and be subject to defamation lawsuits and so on, you can't impose those filters on people. You have to give them the choice. I think that's the standard that needs to be applied across the industry. But Darren, what do you think? What do you think about solutions?
I mean, in terms of like what actual policy implementations would be optimal, I'm not the expert on that. I defer to your judgment on that. I will say, though, that, it's much better to implement what you're saying, or really anything is better than nothing. But my sense of where the real bottlenecks are, and just having some insight into how legislation works, how Washington works, is that any kind of policy mechanism put in place will be very vast, very complicated, and the devil will be not only in the details, but in the people put in the position to implement it. And that's why my sense is that, yes, it's not an excuse not to do anything, but really you're really swimming against the current, where the dominant cultural attitude among basically a vast majority of people in the tech sector with leverage over content moderation specifically have a single view. And there are so many ways, even if you present legislation that sounds good, that's just a general fact of legislation. There's always loopholes, and you can write a piece of legislation, you can write a policy, you can write a regulation that sounds great, that translates really well into talking points that people will hear and celebrate as a victory, but has loopholes. And if you don't have the right people in place to implement it, will simply amount to more of the same, just done in a different way. It's just like analogous to, affirmative action. You can have, affirmative action being abolished, but they'll find another way if you have the people who want that general practice to stay. They find other ways basically to implement affirmative action through other means. And so until you kind of solve the cultural problem and the personnel problem, the dominant environment within these tech moderation spheres, I think you're going to have real limitations as to what you can actually do in practice.
Yeah, I think there are sort of two models people are going for. So the Hawley model is to create this sort of new empower the federal government essentially to regulate the tech giants and have bureaucrats making sure they stay unbiased. It's not the worst idea as long as you can make sure the right personnel are in those positions. But of course, that will change whenever a Democrat comes in, so it's not ideal.
Right.
My opinion is that you need to leave it to the courts. So as soon as you create an industry-wide standard that you can't impose a filter on First Amendment protected speech, you have to give people the option to do that. And if you don't, then you're a publisher. Then it's a question for the courts. Have they done this? Have they not? And if they have done this, then they're going to be, making some pretty big defamation payouts, and that's a threat to their entire business model. No worries, 2020. Want director positions at Google and Co. or cushy jobs at Netflix? Yes, that is the motivation of a lot of people in Washington right now. Big tech has all the money. They're the ones who are promising those big paychecks. It's much like the financial sector's lobby used to be. Let's move on to a different topic, which is, and I'm definitely interested to get your take because you have a background in mathematics, which is big tech's use of algorithms. I see this as a huge double-edged sword, because in the wrong hands, algorithms can be an extremely powerful weapon for censorship, for controlling discourse, especially when you mix it in with the vast amounts of data that Silicon Valley companies have on everyone. They know exactly who the undecided voters are, what issues appeal to them, what sort of stories and videos might persuade them. In fact, one of the scariest things one of my Facebook sources told me was that they've actually built a model for depolarization. So they've taken people who have gone from the far right, or what they call the far right, to the center, and I believe this was in 2017, and built a model for how that happened, the kind of content they watched before they made that transition. And they're using that to build a model to so-called depolarize people. So, according to my Facebook source, they're absolutely using their data to target people with specific information to change their political beliefs. So that's an example of how algorithms can be bad in the wrong hands. But I suppose the bright side of algorithms is that at heart, they're essentially machines for recognizing patterns. And one of the points I make in the book, Deleted, is that pattern recognition is inherently right wing, because if you train an AI or an algorithm or whatever to simply analyze data in a dispassionate manner and spit out conclusions, that's inevitably going to lead to some pretty politically incorrect right-wing conclusions. I mean, imagine an algorithm trained to analyze crime data without any pre-existing political bias. That would quickly lead to conclusions that the left wouldn't like very much.
Right.
So, Darren, what's your thoughts on algorithms in general?
Well, based on what I've seen, the algorithms and machine learning technology themselves, although kind of impressive, I think generally there's a lot of buzz around that specifically. I think the big data issue is a problem. And I think one area that is kind of dangerous is network analysis that's being conducted. So not looking even specifically on the first order term on the information, but looking at the source of information and looking at the networks in terms of how the information spreads and the order in which it spreads. And so basically leaping from having to solve the difficult natural language processing problems of identifying, oh, is this person using a different spelling, or is this person using a colloquialism to circumvent their list of blacklisted words? It's simply, is this person associated with naughty people or a network that's connected to the spread of viral memes that we don't like? And then you simply deboost or throttle people based on networks that kind of circumvents I think the bigger technical problems attendant to actually using natural language processing, machine learning, and so forth.
Right.
I think
the phrase I use is turning down the volume on entire movements.
Right.
We say you ban one person at the center of a network. What that does is it trains the algorithm. Anyone connected to that person is suspect as well. Maybe they won't get banned, but they will get deboosted.
No, exactly. That's precisely right. And they started this in a very big way with I believe it was the Data and Society group. And the Data and Society group traced like all kinds of connected. It was ridiculous in how they phrased it. The big implication that Joe Rogan was this kind of proto alt-right figure spreading alt-right meme, but they did trace a network, and based on their behavior since that report came out, they've been fairly conscientious in terms of wiping out everybody on that network. And so this broader type of network analysis is something that is getting increasingly sophisticated, and that's, I think, maybe what I'm most worried about in terms of the technical capabilities. In terms of the algorithms identifying patterns, you're absolutely right. That is a kind of ironic feature of what algorithm is, or what's supposed to do. Certain types of machine learning, you want to recognize patterns. And so in a way, you could say it's right wing, but of course, there's already a genre among these censorious figures to correct for that. And they're saying, how do we protect these algorithms against the bias that the humans have? It's the humans giving the algorithms the bias, not the algorithms obtaining the bias through objective pattern recognition. And so they're trying to deal with that. And so it is kind of, if you look at it precisely objectively, you say, okay, well, algorithms can indeed recognize patterns, but if they get their way, the patterns that they're going to be recognizing and acting upon are patterns that pertain to the best ways to shut down the generation and spread of anti-narrative content. And so ultimately, like, the pattern recognition is a tool, but if the patterns that they try to figure out are the patterns that are basically how do counter narrative spread, then that's still a bad thing, even though algorithms, left to their own devices, have the capability of recognizing other patterns in reality. So it's just a way. It has to do with how these tools are deployed.
Yep. It's very interesting to me that they have to set up an entire field, talk about this on Tucker Carlson, machine learning fairness, because they know what algorithms will do if left to their own devices. They have to create an entire academic field to make sure they don't become too unbiased. In fact, obviously they call it fairness.
Exactly.
It's the exact opposite of that. So just to drill down on the network analysis thing a little bit more, this group, Defeat Disinfo, you've been looking at this group. I know we cover them at Breitbart News as well. This is a group created by the deep state. It's advised by a retired general who commanded US and NATO forces in Afghanistan. And the group said publicly that they want to invite a network of more than 3.4 million influencers to share visual and emotional narratives from real people in unison and at scale. And it utilizes artificial intelligence originally designed to tackle Islamic State propaganda. So this is amazing. They've built, and this was announced a long time ago, I think maybe over a year ago, this project.
Right.
3.4 million influencers to spread narratives using the same AI they use to counter terrorist propaganda. They're now using this against Trump. The whole purpose of this project, they're very open about it, is to stop Trump being reelected. So, two points. First of all, this sounds a lot like the Russian bots that everyone were complaining about back in 2016 and 2017.
Right.
And second of all, I doubt this network is going to get tagged by the Silicon Valley algorithms for one of their favorite words, coordinated inauthentic behavior, even though that's what it is based on their own definition.
Oh, of course. No, these are not Russian bots. These are freedom bots protecting democracy by deploying military-grade information warfare tools against our democratically elected president. And if that doesn't make sense to you, then you yourself might be Russian, I'm afraid. So that's basically the thinking involved. It's actually, you're absolutely right. It's like there are two things, I guess I would say, about this that are just kind of general take-home points that are very important. One is that, we were talking about this before, is we got to learn how to think of things less in terms of the left box and the right box, the Republicans, the Democrats. This is coming from the national security state. What's going on, people, is that vast swaths of our own national security apparatus are being repurposed and redeployed domestically to shut down the energies associated with Donald Trump's victory. That's what's happening. This organization that McChrystal advises just one piece of that. What you see at DHS with them funding these third-party groups to go after so-called white supremacists. What they mean is just, Trump supporters, effectively. It's a very disturbing trend. And just one point about that specific group. So their technology is based on research funded by DARPA, which is this special Defense Department projects organization. Now, the original purpose, this is really interesting. You mentioned correctly that this was originally meant to go after ISIS, but there was another group. This is very interesting. There's another group that this DARPA-funded project was originally intended to target, and that group was Occupy Wall Street.
Fascinating. Now that is new. I hadn't heard that before.
Exactly. So this DARPA project was funded to go after ISIS and Occupy Wall Street. Now, the interesting and relevant thing, just kind of parenthetically about that, is that Occupy Wall Street says certainly not. It's not something I was a fan of, but it was of a different character from these Antifa protests you see now, because at least Occupy Wall Street was challenging Wall Street interests, powerful financial interests, they're actually challenging powerful institutions. And if you go back to the genealogy of these protests, for instance, the Antifa protests on the WTO in Seattle. This
1999 battle in Seattle.
I don't support them. They were still the kind of disgusting creatures that they are now, but at least they were attacking powerful interests that were also disgusting. So at least one disgusting group fighting another.
It's amazing how gullible they are, isn't it? These Antifa guys. I mean, they spent decades fighting against globalization, and along comes a president who's actually against globalization and kills trade deals.
Right.
And the media tricks them in a matter of months into thinking he's literally Hitler.
But maybe it was trickery, but maybe it connects to what I'm saying, is that the Occupy Wall Street movement was the last movement of this sort that genuinely challenged power structures. Now, why is it that our DARPA, this DoD agency, would be funding information warfare technology that lumps in Occupy Wall Street in some implicative way on the same threat level as ISIS? And now all of a sudden, whatever impulse these groups had to actual challenge power structures, completely gone. And now you have an Antifa that's the complete pet dog of our ruling class and of our national security state. It is a pet dog of every single powerful institution in this country. And that's why every powerful institution, from corporations even to State Department, all these government agencies, in one way or another, lending rhetorical support to the narratives animating Antifa, and sometimes much worse. So I think it's a very interesting connect that narrative that was actually this government-funded DoD technology that they're now using against Trump supporters, that they used to undermine the networks of Occupy Wall Street and to effectively neuter Antifa into a fully compliant paramilitary force for our corrupt ruling class.
It is quite terrifying when you truly understand how vast the power is of this technology that's entirely in their hands now, thanks to the inaction of our elected representatives, most of them. But anyway, I'll have to jump off and leave it there. But this was a fascinating discussion. We should definitely do it again.
Yeah, to be continued. Thank you all.
To be continued.